The WPATH Files, Pseudoscientific Surgical and Hormonal Experiments on Children, Adolescents, and Vulnerable Adults, by McHugh.
A brief history of transgender medicine and the early days of WPATH. The experiment to modify the sex characteristics of people suffering from the psychiatric disorder called gender dysphoria began in the early years of the 20th century with the pioneering work of German sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld. A gay man who engaged in cross-dressing, Hirschfeld coined the term transvestite in his 1910 book Die Transvestiten and regarded both homosexuals and transvestites to be sexual intermediaries. Hirschfeld oversaw the world's first attempt at sex reassignment surgery performed on Karl Baer in 1906. While little is known about the precise nature of the surgery because the records were lost during the 1933 Nazi book burning of Hirschfeld's research, it is believed to have been a metodioplasty, which is the creation of a pseudophallus out of an enlarged clitoris. Baer is thought to have had a disorder of sexual development (DSD) and was reportedly genetically male. In 1919, Hirschfeld opened the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin, which was a first-of-its-kind clinic providing counseling and treatment for physical and psychological sexual disorders, as well as, in particular, for sexual transitions. Notably, Einar Wegener, or Lili Elbe, whose story was popularized in the film The Danish Girl, underwent surgical castration in Berlin under Hirschfeld's supervision in 1930. This was the first in a series of surgeries culminating in a womb transplant in 1931. Elbe died of heart failure 3 months after the final surgery, most likely due to organ rejection. That same year, Dora Richter underwent vaginoplasty, also under the care of Hirschfeld. Erwin Goebant performed Richter's surgery, which is considered the world's first successful male-to-female sex reassignment. Goebant then went on to join the Luftwaffe and participated in the hypothermia experiments conducted at Dachau concentration camp. Despite medical advances such as the development of antibiotics and the ability to create synthetic hormones, interest in sex reassignment procedures waned over the next couple of decades, only to be rejuvenated in the 1950s with the sensational case of Christine Jorgensen. On December 1, 1952, the New York Daily News ran a front-page story under the headline, XGI Becomes Blonde Beauty. Jorgensen had traveled to Denmark the year before and, under the care of Dr. Christian Hamburger, underwent a series of surgeries involving castration and the creation of a semblance of external female genitalia. In 1953, after returning home to the U.S., Jorgensen became a patient of Dr. Harry Benjamin, a German endocrinologist with an interest in transsexualism, as it was known at the time. Benjamin's career in medicine had had a disreputable beginning when, in 1913, he arrived in New York as the assistant of a quack-peddling turtle treatment, a fake tuberculosis vaccine. Benjamin had no formal training in sexology, but as a lifelong friend of Hirschfeld, he had a fascination for the subject, and by the 1950s, his practice was almost exclusively focused on transsexualism. While Jorgensen brought fame and attention to Benjamin's obscure interest in transsexualism, it was another patient who brought the other essential element: money. Rita Erickson, a female who transitioned to live as a man, became Benjamin's patient in 1963. Heir to a fortune, Erickson's philanthropic organization, Erickson Educational Foundation (EF), funded the first 3 international symposiums on gender identity, as well as the newly formed Harry Benjamin Foundation. This enhanced Benjamin's professional status, lending credibility to his sex change experiment. Benjamin coined and popularized the term transsexual with his 1966 book, The Transsexual Phenomenon. Another of Erickson's philanthropic endeavors was to fund North America's first gender clinic at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. It was at this clinic that Dr. John Money conducted his unethical experiments on children born with disorders of sexual development, the most famous case being that of the Reimer twins. As a baby, David Reimer was the victim of a catastrophic medical accident when the cauterizing equipment malfunctioned during his circumcision, amputating his penis. Money convinced David's parents to raise him as a girl, an experiment that failed and ultimately resulted in David committing suicide at age 38. His twin brother Brian had died 2 years previously of an overdose. But Money didn't just experiment on children. During the same period, he attempted to perform sex changes on adults, claiming great success. But when Dr. Paul McHugh became psychiatrist-in-chief at Johns Hopkins in 1975, he commissioned a follow-up study of the adults who had undergone these procedures, which found that while most of the patients claimed to be satisfied and experiencing no regret, there was little change in their psychological functioning. McHugh concluded that Johns Hopkins was, therefore, wasting scientific and technical resources by cooperating with a mental illness rather than trying to study, cure, and prevent it. The clinic was shut down in 1979. Even Erickson's own story has no happily ever after, lending weight to McHugh's conclusions. After commencing hormonal and surgical sex change interventions under the care of Benjamin, Erickson developed a drug addiction and endured a lifelong battle with substance abuse. What followed was 4 failed marriages and a life of turmoil. Erickson's EEF folded in 1977, and the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association HBIGDA was formed in 1978, which would later become WPATH. HBIGDA published its first standards of care SOC in 1979, followed closely by SOC2 in 1980, SOC3 in 1981, and SOC4 in 1990. In its early days, HBIGDA members at least attempted to pursue science and an understanding of this complex psychiatric disorder and the various psychological, hormonal, and surgical interventions available as a form of treatment. But around the late 1990s, the group took a turn. Dr. Stephen B. Levine was the chair of the SOC5 committee in 1998 and recommended that the guidelines require patients to obtain 2 letters from mental health professionals before commencing hormones. Dr. Richard Green, HBIGDA president at the time, was unhappy with this requirement and so immediately commissioned SOC6, which was published just 3 years later and was almost identical, but advised only 1 letter from a mental health professional. In the intervening years, activists began to overtake HBIGDA, and in 2022, Dr. Levine resigned his membership due to his regretful conclusion that the organization and its recommendations have become dominated by politics and ideology, rather than by scientific process, as it was years earlier. In 2007, the organization changed its name to the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. This change was significant. At the stroke of a brush, a loose affiliation of people had appointed themselves as the leading international authority on gender medicine. With the publication of its SOC7 in 2012, the ideological shift identified by Levine was evident. SOC7 recommended puberty blockers as a fully reversible pause for adolescents despite the fact that the experiment was still in its earliest stages, and no such conclusion could be drawn. Also, while on the one hand SOC7 encouraged caution in psychotherapy that affirms the transgender identity, on the other, the guidance endorsed the informed consent model of care, which omits the need for psychotherapy and enables healthcare professionals to provide hormones on demand. This came 2 years after WPATH had issued a statement calling for the Depsychopathologization of gender variance worldwide, which framed being transgender as a normal, healthy variation of human existence. SOC7 followed on from this, suggesting that any mental health issue in a person identifying as transgender is due to minority stress, a result of prejudice and discrimination in society. Then, a year after the publication of SOC7, in line with WPATH, the American Psychiatric Association (APA) released the 5th edition of its Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders DSM-5, in which gender identity disorder was renamed gender dysphoria. This redefinition shifted the focus of diagnosis from the identity itself to the distress and difficulty in social functioning arising from the incongruity between the mind and body. In the decade that passed between the publication of SOC7 and SOC8 in 2022, WPATH veered into new terrain. Just 2 days after SOC8 was published in September 2022, the group hastily removed almost all lower age requirements from the document in a bid to avoid malpractice lawsuits. SOC8 also contains a chapter on non-binary medical interventions, which include recommendations on nullification procedures to create a smooth, sexless appearance for people who identify as neither male nor female, and penis-preserving vaginoplasties for those patients who desire both sets of genitals. Of note, an earlier draft of SOC8 had contained a chapter on ethics, but this was cut from the final version. However, it was the inclusion of a whole chapter on Eunuch as a valid gender identity eligible for hormonal and surgical castration that sent shockwaves through the medical profession and provided the catalyst for the Beyond WPATH Declaration, now signed by more than 2,000 concerned individuals, many of whom are clinicians working with gender-diverse young people. The declaration states that WPATH has discredited itself with its SOC8 and can no longer be viewed as a trustworthy source of clinical guidance in the field of gender medicine. At Environmental Progress, we echo this call and go one step further, calling for reputable medical organizations like the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Psychiatric Association, and the American Medical Association to cut ties with the organization and to abandon its guidelines in favor of ethical, evidence-based medicine. The author of this report contacted each member who appears in the files and a leaked panel discussion requesting comment. However, despite these efforts, only one member of WPATH responded, and that response contained legal threats. Also, a source or sources shared an internal email showing WPATH advising against replying and informing the recipients that WPATH was seeking legal counsel.
This has been a visually annotated unabridged reading of the section of the WPATH Files titled A Brief History of Transgender Medicine and the Early Days of WPATH. See the full WPATH Files report for more information about the lapses in scientific rigor and patient care that have resulted from the prioritization of political activism and ideology over medical ethics and evidence-based medicine.